we have Christian Anarchist and Pumkinswift doing a debate tonight on God's existence. And basically asking, is God knowable? Christian Anarchist is going to be taking that God is knowable. Pumkinswift, God is not knowable. We're going to have 10 minutes for each to do their openings. Then we're going to have a 40-minute back and forth, maybe longer if they're up to it. And then we'll do Q&A closing statements from there. So whenever you're ready, Christian Anarchist, you can start your opening, bud.
Alrighty, so the debate tonight is about whether or not God is knowable, and I'm taking the position that he is knowable, but it depends entirely what you mean by knowable. And I honestly think this discussion is going to be split into essentially two parts. How do we verify what is knowable? And then once we agree on a mode of analysis of how we verify that, does it follow from the mode of analysis that we choose that God is in fact knowable? And in what sense? Because, for example, God is, we argue that God is infinite, so that because God is infinite, you would require infinite knowledge to know him fully, so you can't fully know God. But just because you can't fully know God, you can know, like, of his existence, for example. So the mode of analysis that I will be arguing for is a sort of, well, see, I don't believe that indubitable certainty is actually something we can have as human beings. I believe in terms of what we can and cannot know, it's a matter of things being probably true or probably not true. So, for example, I could be 90% confident in certain things being true, but barring a couple of blind spots that I might have in my knowledge, I would, treat that 90% as, a good reason to believe in whatever I would say has 90% confidence. And I would also say that, uh, when it comes to debates around God's existence, the mode of analysis that usually tends to take you towards God is rationalism, which is something I would be advocating for and arguing. I, because if you're a rationalist, there are many arguments that you can take to that can that seem to imply that it's more likely that God does exist than that he doesn't. And so I believe that we can know from a rationalist perspective that God is more likely to exist than to not exist. And I am arguing from more of a mere theism kind of argument. Now, of course, if you're an empiricist, I can make a lot of logical arguments and that sort of thing, and it's not going to mean much to you. Which means, from an empirical standpoint, or I guess not a pure empiricist, but a primarily sort of empiricist mode of analysis, the arguments I make may or may not be viable. Now, that's not to say that I'm not going to use any empirical evidence at all. I am, but as a rationalist, I believe the job of logic and rationality is to organize empirical evidence into sort of a logical framework which makes sense of the evidence, right? Like, for example, in order to do statistics, you have to take empirical evidence, but you have to imply principles of mathematics in order for statistics to even like exist. So that'll be like one half of what I imagine we'll be debating mostly, and then the other half is what follows from rationalism. So I guess I would take a very sort of dualist perspective in a sense, and I believe that every single argument that advocates for God's existence ultimately comes down to attributing consciousness to something. We believe that God is a consciousness of some kind, and that like every argument, like for example, the cosmological argument is attributing consciousness to the first cause. Um, the moral argument is attributing consciousness to the moral grounding of you know re- uh, of morality, I guess, and so on and so forth. So I guess our debate is mostly going to come down to an understanding of consciousness and how it differentiates it. How do we differentiate consciousness from non-consciousness? Because, for example, if consciousness is nothing more than physical processes, and we're claiming that the first cause of the universe, a process, was conscious, well, how do we determine that if both consciousness and non-consciousness are purely physical? Um, but if there is a way to differentiate the two, I would argue that consciousness has a certain spontaneity attributed to it, unlike the deterministic aspects of physical processes. Conscious things have a certain spontaneity to it, and if there is a first cause, which would be by definition a spontaneous event, and it is more likely that it is conscious because that's how consciousness would operate than it being a deterministic physical process. And so we can make lots of arguments like that. And the main argument I would like to make is an argument from a priori knowledge. Now, I'm not arguing that we a priori know God necessarily, or that I'm making a presuppositional argument. I'm arguing backwards from the fact that I believe we have a priori knowledge, and from that, I believe we can argue that God exists. And here's how I would defend that. So, premise one is that we have a priori knowledge. I have a supporting argument to defend why I believe that. Premise two is that by definition, a priori knowledge cannot be prompted by empirical sensations or like a physical process. Because knowledge that is a posteriori is knowledge that is sort of prompted by a physical empirical sensation, light hitting your eyes and bumping into other chemicals in your brain that produce a thought. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about when I say uh, a priori knowledge. And when I say a priori knowledge, I don't necessarily mean like inborn knowledge. I mean any knowledge that is gained without experience. So that is done through primarily through logical deduction, and not necessarily because some sort of empirical experience caused that for you to think that. Now, from that, because we know that a priori knowledge cannot be caused by the physical, we also know that human beings can't make up a priori knowledge for two reasons. One, it has been psychologically proven that we can't really just make up new stuff without taking stuff we already know and remixing it. So let me give you an example. I can think of a golden mountain. Now, a golden mountain doesn't exist in my experience. However, gold and mountain do exist in my experience, and I can remix the two to produce in my mind the idea of a golden mountain. And so a priori knowledge would not work like that, because a priori knowledge, well, in order to be able to have knowledge for you to make up, you need to already possess knowledge. So like you can't like fabricate knowledge out of nothing. You need to sort of, it's like Legos. You need to have already a preset set of building blocks in order to um, create the knowledge. So if we know we human beings didn't make up a priori knowledge, and we know that it wasn't caused by like some sort of physical empirical sensation, then if we trace the causality back to it, where would we say this a priori knowledge came from? Well, it seems to be that knowledge as a thing can only exist within a mind, unless of course it's transferred by a physical medium. But as we've already discussed, that can't be the case with a priori knowledge. So if a priori knowledge must exist in a mind, and it didn't come from us humans, we didn't make it up, then it must have existed. There must have been like a first mind that just possessed this a priori knowledge, right? So how did that first mind get that a priori knowledge? Well, it either had the a priori knowledge eternally, which means that it is itself an eternal mind, which means that we now have a eternal consciousness, which a timeless eternal consciousness would certainly heavily imply God. Or the other alternative is that this God, this first consciousness that had this a priori knowledge, would have had to have fabricated it out of nothing, ex nihilo, in other words. And I believe that I don't really think that would even be possible necessarily. But I believe that if they did do that, that was essentially like an ability you would attribute to God, being able to create things ex nihilo. Um, and so that would be like you. So what we would be able to prove with that argument is that a priori knowledge originates from a consciousness that is either eternal or able to create things out of nothing. Now, if you might say, well, that's not technically God, I'd say that I would strongly argue that that certainly is what we would be talking about with God. We certainly haven't proven other attributes of God, like you know, uh, but like even if we were just talking about a very limited God, this is certainly something we would still be talking about at the end of the day. Um, if that makes sense. So we haven't like talked about other attributes like omniscience or omnipotence necessarily, but an eternal consciousness that existed to give us this a priori knowledge um, is uh, yeah, anyway. So now a possible objection to this would be, well, we got a priori knowledge from evolution. And so the argument goes, all right, well, so you would have inherited this knowledge genetically from your parents. Okay, where did they get it from? Their parents. Okay, and keep pushing it back and forward. You keep kicking the can up the road, and eventually you will you will have you will have to find either like the first being that had this a priori knowledge, and you'd still have to ask where they get it from, or you have an infinite regress of consciousnesses or conscious eye, or whatever you want to call it, and that does not seem to purport to any evidence, like in any way, unless, of course, you want to say that consciousness is nothing more than a physical process indistinguishable from other processes, which I would dispute, but I imagine we'll get into it as we go on. Um, but yeah, and I guess that's my argument. I yield my time.
Thank you. Thank you for that opening. Um, Pumkinswift, if you're ready, you can start.
Yeah, go ahead and tell me when you're starting the timer.
Started it.
Okay, so the first thing I'd like to fucking, of course, it starts right now. Okay, sorry. The first thing I would like to talk about when in this debate is exactly like why it is that we think that these sorts of arguments can lead us to what would have to be uh, things about the nature of the universe itself rather than just things about like how we go about learning about the universe. And so what I mean by that is I don't think that you can come up I guess you might call this a form of empiricism. I don't think that we can through only rational arguments come to a something that proves a physical or metaphysical reality outside of ourselves. And the reason I think this is, let me give an example. So there's a theory that's been going around called like simulation theory. Basically, it posits that we are more likely than not in a simulation rather than a real universe. The reason is if we assume a that there is that it is possible that we could be in a simulation, right? We assume that the technology to create a simulation like our universe exists, then whatever race or whatever it is that is creating that simulation could likely create multiple simulations. And in fact, within those simulations, if it's possible that, you know, we as humans could get to a point where we can simulate a universe, then within those simulated universes, it would probably come about eventually that there would be other things like humans, other species like humans that could also simulate universes. And so what you get is a sort of infinite number of universes, most of which are simulations, and only one of which necessarily needs to be an actual universe. In which case, it becomes far more likely than not that we are in a simulation rather than being inside of a real universe. Now, the reason why I reject this is that I don't think that it makes sense for us to simply just say, oh, I can come up with a set of things that if we assume a few things are true, such as if we assume the fact that you can in fact simulate a universe, sort of like our universe, that means that we should jump and say, well, this is the case, right? So I think during any sort of laying out these types of arguments, when we're ever sort of laying out the steps of these things, we're going to make a few assumptions about how the world works that we don't necessarily know are true, right? And I think when we go over your argument, we'll find a few of those. But for the first thing I would like to ask is, do you accept that we exist within a simulation right now? Do you reject that idea, that the argument I laid out for us being in a simulation, or do you think that this is like disanalogous in some way? Because I think that I don't think you can reject this while also proposing the sort of arguments you've made for the existence of God, because I think that this argument holds about as well as any sort of arguments for the existence of God. I simply reject them because I don't think that it makes sense to create more assumptions about where the universe came from and all that sort of stuff. And so now I don't necessarily want to spend all my time arguing against you before we get to the open discussion period, tackling all these arguments that you've had. However, there are, I guess, some questions I would like to start use my time to talk about some of the claims you made and what exactly it means. So first off, you said that you're a rationalist, or you think that from rationalism we can get to where we are. So I would first like to ask, uh, how exactly you're defining rationalism? I just want a definition of that word so I can understand what you're saying. I also want to ask, what exactly is a priori knowledge? Like, if you can give me a definition on that word, so I can understand exactly what you're talking about in this. And I would also like an example of a priori knowledge in order to know exactly what it is that you mean. Because we'll get more to this debate once I go ahead and cede my time here, because I probably don't need the full 10 minutes. But I can't imagine any sort of a priori knowledge that humans have that we would necessarily need a God to have gotten to. I can't imagine anything. Even the rules of logic in math, I think, are completely explainable within a naturalistic explanation of the universe. So, other than like asking for those a few things, I don't think I really have anything else to spend this time on. So, if we could just move on to actually getting those few definitions. I think that's where we should go to next.
Yeah, thank you for that opening. I'll yield that time and just add it to the back and forth. Um, and you guys can go ahead and get into that now.
Alrighty, so there was a few good questions there. So the first one I want to deal with is the simulation question. If we can use all these logical arguments to prove God, couldn't we do the same with a simulation?
Well, actually,
Um,
if I can please interrupt, I would definitely like if you could. I do want to get to that definitely, but I would like if you could define rationalism a priori knowledge real quick. Like just if we get the definition of the words done first, I think that would probably be better than getting to the arguments.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So rationalism, as I am using the word now, it could mean a lot of different things, but how I'm using it is that I'm saying that um, logical principles take priority in a sense over empirical ones, not in the sense that because both give you truth and both are required. I don't really want to make pure logical arguments. A lot of the arguments I'm making are sort of similar, they're not the same, but they're similar to Immanuel Kant's arguments, and um, I like his writings and everything. So he would talk about how you can't really have any knowledge about the world without empiricism, but he was still a rationalist. And so basically, the way I'm thinking of it is that the logical principles are like, think of it like this to use an analogy, puzzle solving. Logic is like so empiricism is other pieces of the puzzle, and logic is how you put those puzzles uh, together, basically. So like knowing like for example, you can even without even touching a puzzle, you can figure out, all right, well, some of this puzzle must have edges. Those edges are gonna be flat, and they're gonna go on the outside, so I can arrange them in a certain. I can figure out which edges have which puzzle pieces have edges and put them around the edges, and you could do that even without touching a puzzle. Um, and that's what I mean by rationalism, is using logical principles to organize the empirical world in order to let it tell us what it's saying, if that makes sense. And as
Okay.
for a priori,
Yeah, I was
oh
gonna ask
sorry, yeah,
what you could just define a priori knowledge real quick.
yeah. So a priori knowledge is knowledge gained without experience. So you don't have to be born with it. You can be born with it. Um, but so an example, I suppose the best way to explain it would be like an example that I would use, which is the ability to learn deductively. So here's an example. There's the law of induction. Um, People get the law of induction because they observe empirically, we observe processes in nature that seem to repeat themselves. And so learning induction tends to go a little something like this, whether it's conscious or subconscious, the way we learn it. So for example, I might see the sun come up every day and I go, okay, I see the sun come up. It happens every single day. Therefore, there must be some sort of uniformity to nature, just as an
Yeah, so
example.
I would dispute whether or not that's knowledge. I don't think that I wouldn't define that as knowledge, but that's a whole other thing we can get to later. So I guess do you think you move
Well,
on to your
I was just gonna
yeah
say we could define it as like a belief then, like something like an idea we have in our
well
head. Like even if it's not true, like it's something we
mhm.
believe, like, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I guess we could do that. So what exactly is your argument against the idea that so I guess first off, do you think we're in a simulation?
I actually don't. I'm completely agnostic as far as simulation theory goes.
Okay, that's
Um,
fine.
I believe that regardless of whether we're in a simulation, there had to be another universe that isn't a simulation, and we still can make these arguments about that universe, basically.
Yeah, and that's fine. The only thing I wanted to get to with the idea of simulation theory is why is it that you think that it's okay to be like it makes more sense to be agnostic about simulation theory, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to be agnostic about whether or not there is a god. I just want to see where's the logical difference between those two ideas.
Oh, that's a good question. So because the way I approach rationalism is, like I mentioned before, I don't believe there's such a thing as indubitable certainty, and that puts me at enmity with a lot of other rationalists. But I believe that, so for example, so I look at things in terms of like all the beliefs that I have, I would ascribe a probability of those beliefs to being true. So for example, um, okay, let's take the argument that I believe in God. I believe God exists. Well, when I say that, I mean that he's more likely to exist than to not exist, basically.
Mhm.
So, for example, I might say that I've got to reckon maybe a 60, 70, maybe 80% chance that God exists based on what I know, based on what I believe. Now, as far as simulation theory goes, I believe that there is a sub 50% chance that we are in a simulation. It's probably something like maybe even 49% likely. But I believe that if an argument is but less than 50% likely to be true, then there's another argument, an alternative argument, which is more likely, and that argument is we don't have enough information. So believing that we don't have enough information about a topic is itself an argument that needs proof and it needs support, but it is an argument
No,
that would
I don't think that that's correct. I think saying that we don't know enough to come to a conclusion is different from saying like well the counter positive would be we actually know that we aren't in a simulation. You would provide actual positive arguments for that. The making a positive claim is just categorically different from not coming to a conclusion about a positive claim. Those are different things. So
so
all you need to do to reject a claim is to say that there isn't sufficient evidence for it. That isn't even necessarily saying that the claim is false. It's simply saying that it's not true.
well, that I would agree with that, but my basis for agreeing with that is that the idea that we don't have sufficient evidence is itself more likely to be true than not. Like, so for example, let's take Holocaust denial, for example. Let's say you're debating, I don't want to like, I'm not saying that like, just to be clear, I'm using an extreme example, right? But let's say you're debating a Nazi and he says, listen, I'm not saying the Holocaust didn't happen. I'm just saying I don't have enough proof to believe it did. Now, they would be making a disingenuous argument because there is overwhelming evidence that the Holocaust did happen, right? So I would argue that a person making that argument would need to provide reason why, a positive reason why, or at least explain the evidence away in some form or another. The burden of proof would be on the person who's saying we don't have enough information in the face of sufficient information.
Yeah, well,
So I believe so that
I
for
would
me
say in this specific example, sorry, I just want to say in this specific example, the issue is that I think that person is likely lying because they probably just are an anti-Semite or whatever. So it's not. I don't think it's the best analogy, but I understand what you're saying. I agree that there is a point where like uh there is such sufficient evidence for a proposition that even claiming agnosticism on the proposition is irrational. I get what you're getting to at that level.
yeah, so like it's like in school, right? Like when like if you have a multiple choice test, right? And one of the option is sometimes in school they would give you the option of saying like option C would be like we don't have enough information to solve the equation, for example. That could still be a correct or incorrect argument, right? And so you'd have to
Yeah, I
weigh up
understand what you mean.
likelihood. Yeah, so to continue on with that, so I believe that a priori knowledge. So we were talking before about a priori knowledge. I do believe I need to support my argument there. Um, an example I would give. So I used the example before of induction. We believe in induction because, for example, we see the sun come up every day. It continues to happen, and then we say, therefore, that we believe in induction. But in order to get induction from that empirical experience, you have to insert a therefore. And I believe that that therefore is not contained within the empirical experience. It's prompted by the empirical experience. And this is exactly something Kant would talk about, a priori knowledge being triggered by empirical experience because it's not pure synthetic a priori or something like that. Um, so like the empirical experience does prompt us to deduce this with logic, but the question is, if the therefore that I mentioned is not contained within the empirical experience, the question then becomes, how does our brains, whether it's correct or not, how do our brains insert that therefore? And I believe that when it comes to our brains are like little pachinko machines where they accept little bits of empirical evidence, and our brains sort of organize them into piles, if you will.
Yeah. So,
Um,
okay. So I guess I want to get up on a question. I want a very simple answer. Do you think that like mathematics is like a priori knowledge, or do you think mathematics is just something humans like invented? Like, is there a difference there?
um, I would say that so there are arguments that are a priori, but not pure a priori. So I do think that mathematics could be a priori, or it can also be empirical. So for example, if I pick up two sticks, right? I'm looking at one stick. I'm looking at another stick. There's two sticks. I put them together and I attribute the number 2 to it. Now that's prompted by experience, but our brains are doing the attributing. Our brains are
Yeah, but
inserting
okay, so
the.
what about something more specific, like calculus, for example? Like calculus was invented by Sir Isaac Newton, right? Wasn't like discovered. It was a, a feat of pure mathematics. So would you say that that was uh, an a priori knowledge, or would you say that that's not?
Yeah, I would say that's a priori because he didn't. It's not like he experienced calculus, right? He deduced it out, right?
Yeah.
He used the already established logical principles that he used, and he inserted. Well, he inserted the logic into that. Now, I would maybe dispute. Maybe it's just a matter of terminology. I guess I probably wouldn't say that he invented it. I'd say he discovered it because I do believe mathematics is true, and it's like true
Yeah, I
independent
guess
of
I would disagree with that. We could talk about that more later. But so I guess the thing that I would my counter argument to what you presented so far is that I don't see in any way how the naturalistic explanation for the universe can't account for what you've described as a priori knowledge. So the first major counter argument for this is that we actually see a extremely smooth gradient of consciousness emerging throughout different forms of life, right? We see the response to stimuli in like the very basic forms of life, and we see that response to stimuli grow more and more complex throughout the animal kingdom, uh, all the way up to humanity. And that smooth gradient seems to account for consciousness. Now, whatever we call consciousness, I agree, consciousness is a very hard thing to define, but consciousness is just like what we describe as our experience, and it's very difficult for us to uh, due to how like investigating techniques with all sorts of psychological claims are, it's very difficult for us to like even investigate whether or not, like, for example, a dog has consciousness. We know they respond to stimuli. We know they have the ability to think. What exactly consciousness means and what exactly that is, and whether or not we should say dogs have consciousness is a much more prickly debate. But the thing is that if we go through all the entire animal kingdom, we see a smooth gradient of that developing. And so it seems to me very strange to say that like a priori knowledge can't come without a god, considering that we see the emergence of what seems to be consciousness throughout evolution. And you did prompt that, but I don't see why that isn't a sufficient explanation.
So that's a very interesting argument. So I would agree that consciousness as a whole might have a smooth gradient, but it's because I do believe it is possible to have empirical experiences independent of a priori knowledge. And so how it will work is that you've got a very simple creature whose brain is just sort of like let's use the dog like for example that you're using. I don't think dogs logically deduce things. I don't think they use logic or
Well,
mathematics. I think that I
but
was
I
just gonna say
mean,
I think that like
yeah. So go ahead.
sorry go on.
Well,
I was
okay.
just gonna say
Sorry.
that.
Go ahead. It's fine.
Oh,
It's fine. Sorry.
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 um, so I was just gonna say, like, dogs will like take in empirical experiences, and they'd say things like, "Okay, I see the sun. I see it come up every day," and they're capable of having that conscious experience, but they're not capable of deducing, induction from that. And so I agree that in terms of response to stimuli, there is a very smooth gradient. I 100% agree with that. But what I don't agree with is the smooth gradient of an aspect of consciousness, which is the capacity to rationalize and deduce and
Well,
use that kind of a priori
Well,
knowledge.
that's
Because
strange because we
as
do
far as
actually see that. Well, for example, Pavlov, when we talk about Pavlovian responses, that initial research literally came from dogs. Dogs started salivating anytime they heard the bell ring because every time he fed them, he rang the bell. So they started to associate that, and they like literally deduced that a bell ringing meant that they were going to get fed and began salivating. We figured out that part of human psychology from dogs. Like that's literally the example we use. And in fact, we see like tool usage in different members of the primate family, and through anthropology we actually see the human tool usage getting more and more complicated over time, and a ton of other stuff like that. So there is in fact not only a smooth gradient of the ability to look at stimuli, but it seems the ability to like deduce things is also has a fairly smooth gradient throughout the animal kingdom. Now it's hard to see that nowadays because all of the other smartest animals, all the other ones that were most like us humans, all died out. They're all extinct now. Homo sapiens, or Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, they all went away, and so did like most of our other relatives. So whether like exactly what that looks like is very hard for us to investigate. But from the anthropological evidence we do have, there is a smooth gradient of tool usage. There is a smooth gradient of other forms of animals being able to rationally deduce things. So it just seems like what you just said there was false.
No, okay, so with the Pavlovian response, I think you're misattributing what is a logical deduction to what is an instinct. I think that instinctually, like instincts, I would attribute, like even in humans or anything like that, wholeheartedly, I would attribute it to empirical experiences because it's an impression that it makes on your physical brain. So we have parts of our brain that where like that essentially store our experiences and they inform like psychological association. So for example, if I keep on tapping you on the shoulder and say the word, I don't know, Tuesday, and I just keep tapping you Tuesday, 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 then every time I tap you on the shoulder, even without saying Tuesday, you're going to think the word Tuesday. Like it's going to be like that kind of, so like a, again, like a Pavlovian response, but that is because of that can be attributed to the empirical experience. It's not so much a logical deduction because it's instinctual. Like when you experience it yourself, for example, when you have these instinctual uh, Pavlovian responses, they're not something that you're logically deducing in that moment. It's a psychological subconscious response attributed to the physical brain. It's not something that is a
Well,
priori.
but the thing is that all of our we have not obviously the field of psychology we have not any psychological can't explain physically yet. We don't know everything about psychology, obviously. This is a difficult subject to talk on, but and especially when I was talking about Pavlov, like the issue is not just that like other animals are capable of like having a Pavlovian response. The fact is that there are some animals that don't have Pavlovian responses because their brains aren't developed enough, and then there are lots of animals that do, and then there are other animals such as other apes that can do things like do tool usage. There are things like crows that seem to be able to demonstrate problem solving when they try to get food from things using different like I can't remember the exact experiment, but they can do things like figure out how to put money into a vending machine to get food from it. That's things that have happened. Like city crows do that, and especially when we go down like primates and anthropology, and we try to study like the primate lineages. There isn't just like a gradient of like human development, but before humans, there seems to be a gradient in our tool usage, and there are other animals that seem to be more or less capable of problem solving. And that seems to suggest to me that the sort of a priori knowledge you're talking about can be developed to through evolution. And the thing is, in order to prove that your argument is true, you don't just have to say that oh, we don't have evidence to suggest that. You would have to prove that that's impossible somehow.
Oh, I don't think I'd have to prove it's impossible. I just have to prove it's less likely. Remember, that's I don't believe in impossibilities. Remember, I approach things from a probabilistic situation. Um, but
Well,
in terms, so I want to sort of
well,
what I want to do is I want to sort of sorry, go on.
well, I just want to say, like, the thing is about like we talk about probability, you have to weigh like because in order to say that this is the case, like you're making a very large claim about the nature of the universe, right? You're making that from the position of a priori knowledge. And so from my perspective, if there is even a small chance that what we can see developed through evolution, I think that that's still more likely than suggesting this far larger claim that needs a far lot more evidence. Now, if you can provide more evidence, that gets more likely, obviously. But I think if this is like the main thrust of your argument, you do need to prove that it is impossible in order to prove your thing. It only becomes like slight, like even if you prove that it's only like a 1% chance, I still think that makes the God proposition, with only this argument at least, still very unlikely. It seems to me far more likely that even if there's only like a 1% chance that what we got through evolution, since we understand that more, we have far more evidence about how evolution works and far more pathways uh, for it to have worked through, rather than this thing that we have what seems to be very small amounts of evidence for. I don't think that probabilistically you necessarily get to like, oh yeah, there's a above 50% chance that God exists just by proving that it's unlikely that this thing is true.
So I would dispute a couple of things. So well, let me try to take it in pieces here. So first of all, you said that even if there was a 1% chance that naturalism uh, it could explain an argument as opposed to something else, you're sort of assuming naturalism as the default, in which case I would ask why and why we should sort of like because I'm treating both ideas as like equal, like having equal weight until the evidence falls into one category or another, right? And if naturalism can explain a priori knowledge, then I guess
Well,
then we would
it's for the
that
same
that would
reason. This is why I brought the simulation thing. It's for the same reason I reject the simulation thing because I because I don't take arguments to show that something is the case until I have like actual testable evidence for something. Just because I don't have like a way to disprove something uh, eh, or something like that, I don't think that you make this large leap in logic. I think you have to build up to that through evidence. And also, when we talk about naturalism, naturalism has been like verified by like all of this other evidence. Like we talk about like the ability for evolution to get somewhere. We're not just like proposing that out of nowhere. We got to our understanding of evolution through tons of itty bitty pieces of evidence through like literally hundreds of years, right? So if you want to propose some sort of supernatural thing, you would also have to give me a ton of evidence to overturn what would be a naturalistic paradigm that has been corroborated like many times over. So sorry, go ahead. I'm all in that there.
that's all good. So I just wanted to say that first of all, in terms of you saying that naturalism has been verified by all this other evidence, no, 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 that's not how it quite works, really, because first of all, naturalism isn't itself a very well defined, I guess, a very well defined, what would you
Can I
call it?
explain what I mean by that?
Sure, sure, go ahead.
Naturalism has or what I mean by that is that there aren't necessarily like any holes in naturalism, as in we haven't run into something that we need supernaturalism to explain yet. Everything that naturalism has come up against, we've been able to explain through naturalistic means, and like there aren't any holes in science that are so gaping and so like horrible that like we need to invoke supernatural causes to get around them.
Well, see, first of all, I don't think that supernatural is a term that has any meaning, and that's why I dispute that naturalism is even a term that has any meaning. First of all, but second of all, your position is then unfalsifiable, because if we came across something new that would poke a hole in naturalism, you could still make the exact same argument that previously we had not made any discoveries that poked holes in naturalism, and we've been following it for years, so we should just keep doing it. That's almost like an argument from like a traditionalist sort of like a naturalist sort of thing, because it would be extremely difficult for any new evidence to poke holes if we are relying on the fact that anything that comes before that evidence never poked any holes, right? Um, so like it's kind of like you're just sort of assuming naturalism a little bit. It's not just that you're assuming naturalism, it's that you're saying, well, supernatural explanations are far more unlikely as a category. I don't even know what you mean. Like I think I have a colloquial, I can't say this word, colloquial understanding of what it means to have um I guess, like a supernatural belief. But like like the borders of that idea, I think that it's a very arbitrary term, and it means different things to different people. I honestly just don't know like what the supernatural means,
Yeah,
basically.
and if
Like
I can
if
explain more in depth, so the reason I propose this is because we've through our history of like knowledge, right? Like there's been a history of this type of discussion going throughout the centuries, and there's always been this sort of like God of the gaps idea, right? This idea that we don't know how this works, so therefore God did it. And steadily over time, the God of the gaps has been shrinking to a smaller and smaller gap as our knowledge of the natural world grows, right? And well, the thing is as of right now, it seems to me that there are very few like phenomena that we see in the world that we uh haven't like there are obviously things we don't know, but there are very few things in the world that seem like we would need a supernatural like a to say God did it or whatever else. Like it seems like anything we can observe within the natural world can be explained by natural means as far as like it's not like a god did it or a ghost did it or anything like that. So that's what I mean when I say that naturalism seems to mostly work. It just seems that like there isn't anything we're encountering. There's just like, well, we have no idea like how this works currently. We have no idea how to investigate to get to that point. Everything we're discovering, we have an idea of what we should do to figure out like how something works.
So I would actually dispute that. So, like, for example, anytime we do find something, you mentioned before that there are a few things we don't really quite know how to explain from a naturalistic perspective, and the idea is, well, we've done naturalistic explanations before, we'll do it again. But you mentioned God of the gaps. Well, I think might just be naturalism of the gaps. You're using a principle of induction, I suppose, to presume that, well, naturalism's worked for us before. I guess it'll just keep working for us. Let's ride this train while it's good, you know. But then nothing could ever derail that train from perspective, because anytime there is
Well,
a gap in
actual
what
evidence for
naturalism.
a supernatural occurrence could derail that train. The thing is that the thing is that people propose supernatural explanations, and every time a supernatural explanation gets proposed, it either gets falsified, or we find a natural explanation that works better, or something else like that, right? So, like when I talk about gaps in our knowledge, I mean things like there's currently like a debate about string theory in physics, right? We're trying to figure out the theory of relativity and whether or not that's the best explanation for gravity. We're trying to figure out exactly what dark matter and black holes are, because we don't know exactly what that is yet, and like it's stuff like that. And none of those things feel like they need a god to exist to explain what they are. And whenever people have proposed things like a god to explain something, it doesn't like that never actually sticks. And any sort of ability to like falsify to like test a supernatural proposition, if you say like a god is doing this or whatever, seems to fail. And like again, even in this conversation, for instance, you said a priori knowledge needs a god in order to exist. I don't see any evidence of that anywhere. So maybe we could just get back to that, since that's like a more, if you could present evidence to me about why we would need exactly a supernatural explanation for how consciousness came about as opposed to a naturalistic one, that would be evidence in favor of a supernatural thing. So I feel like we should probably just move there with the conversation.
Yeah, so I got two things to say about that. So first of all, an example of what you were talking about before, where it's like we kind of have to have a supernatural explanation for it. Now, again, I despise the term supernatural, but I'll grant that word for now. An example would be something called terminal lucidity, and it's something that, like, because I've seen quite a bit of studies on it, and I even, like, because my mother works as a nurse who worked in palliative care for a while, she herself has observed this phenomenon, and I encourage you to research it in your own time. I could even provide sources in, like, if you prefer. Um, Basically, I'm not saying that there currently is an official supernatural explanation, again, because I don't really like the term supernatural, and I don't think they do either. But all of the physicalist, will say, all of the physicalist explanations for how terminal lucidity is even possible have thus far failed. Because what terminal lucidity is that basically you have this phenomenon where, let's say you have somebody with dementia or Huntington's disease or any sort of brain damage, anything that could possibly damage the brain, where like the physical aspect of the brain is permanently damaged and they can't recover. What would happen is that we do observe people recovering in ways that they medically should not be recovering, moments before death. Sometimes it's hours, sometimes it's days, sometimes it's weeks, and in very rare cases it's months. So for example, you could, if you have like Huntington's, the part of your brain that tells your legs to walk might just disintegrate and rot away, and a person with Huntington's can end up walking again because of the terminal acidity. We don't know how the hell that happens, but all physicalist explanations thus far have failed, from what I've seen in the research, because uh, like it relies on the physical brain being intact in order for it to do what it needs to do, which we know is extremely unlikely to be the case unless these guys are like Deadpool or something and their brains are rapidly healing or something like that. Um, but that itself, I would say that's more miraculous than what is being put forward as explanations for that. So that's an example of where naturalism has sort of hamstrung us, because they, like, naturalistic scientists just refuse outright to try and study this.
I
Anyway, and
highly doubt that the idea that there's this medical phenomena that we don't have an explanation for. People are just like, yeah, we don't want to study this. That seems very
well,
unlikely.
it's frustratingly true. Like there's like it's an extremely, like, well, not extremely common, but it's a pretty common phenomenon. Like we've scientifically sort of proven that it does happen. We just don't know why. And there's two reasons why we refuse to study it. One, because it might involve cutting open a person's brain as they're dying and they just got better. That there's ethical concerns around that for obvious reasons, but also because naturalists tend not to want to. Because some naturalists are like, listen, I don't know if this does prove naturalism or doesn't prove naturalism. I don't really care. But if this is going to lead us to non-naturalistic expectations or something, then a naturalistic, like naturalism can't
Yeah, I
solve
just
for it.
I don't care. Like this is what happens every time I get to like an argument about science. Like every time that somebody has a claim about something scientific that they have a difficult time proving, they just say there's a conspiracy against it. I don't like if
Conspiracy. It's just like it's just a it's
well,
just an attitude. Like it's not like it
well,
is true that there is
essentially what
like
you're saying is that like they're all of academia is unwilling to study this thing because they're biased against it. I mean, I just to be quite frank, I
no, it's not that. That's not what you've extrapolated a little bit of what I said. I'm just saying that there are certain reasons why they don't think they can. They don't. It's not a matter of that they don't want to, but there is certainly for whatever reason like there is a certain like that people do seem a little bit allergic to studying this, not because like there's some sort of Illuminati conspiracy going on, but because well for a number of reasons, one of which I said was like had nothing to do with being a naturalist. It was ethical concerns, as I had
yeah, I
mentioned.
understand
And
that.
so
But okay, well, if I can
yeah,
just
like
say, like, okay, so the thing about this is, like, it seems to me like the best answer to this question until we like do further study is simply that we don't know. I don't think this is like necessarily pushes us
don't know
in either or
exactly.
direction. Okay, but that
So
doesn't
this
mean
is
that like that doesn't really have a bearing on like naturalism versus supernaturalism. In order to have evidence for
yeah,
supernaturalism, you would have to prove that like or evidence that naturalism can't explain this. You would have to prove that naturalism can explain this. Like you would have to, this would have to stuff scientific. Like, yeah, for a fact that we can't explain this, and like until we've actually done that, because you've suggested that this isn't a heavily studied topic, I don't see where we
well, there
should
is
like take this
literature.
thing to push it in any direction.
So I wouldn't say it's not heavily studied. Like there's lots of studies out there that show that terminalicity is a real thing, and there's lots of meta-analysis which comment on other studies. And most of the comments that they make is that there is a lack in trying to figure out the actual cause of terminalicity. Like the actual attempts to be made are like pretty lacking. That's just what the papers themselves say. But as for what you just invoked there, you just said, well, we don't know, so therefore naturalism. You're
No,
you're
I didn't
doing it.
say
You're
therefore
doing what I
naturalism. I
described.
said therefore we don't know. I
No,
said
you
that this
said
is no. I was just careful with my words there. What I meant to say, no matter what, was that this isn't evidence in either direction. We don't know the answer for this, and until we do know for a fact one way or the other, it isn't evidence for anything.
So I
The-
wonder how frustrated you would be if you lived in a society where theism was the default and they were making their exact same arguments you're making right now in the other direction. So I want you to assert yourself as a hypothetical that you live in a world, maybe in the medieval times, where like theism is sort of like the default idea of society, and like scholars are like, well, listen, there are certain things theism can't currently explain, but if we like for example, we can't explain let's say, for example, we can't explain why railroad spikes seem to mess up brain chemistry, but theism has a long, proud tradition of solving these problems in the past. And you know what? Every single time one of these atheists comes to me and says, "Oh, there's a naturalistic explanation," they're always proven wrong because theism seems to triumph. Well, that's still begging the question: why is theism the default? Why is that one the 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 uh the null hypothesis, as it were? Why are we saying that one is like inherently more likely as another? Like it's not just a matter of you using the
Well,
evidence to
see,
lead you to.
the difference here is that in that society, like that wouldn't be theism or like, well, okay. So what I'm trying to appeal to is what I'm trying to appeal to are the actual scientific theories that have been verified and the scientific method as a practice being used to find things out. Theism at no point in human history has been used to figure things out. It's been a study of like a philosophical thing. Like that's a totally different thing. People argue philosophically about theism and about atheism all the time, but that isn't the same thing as saying like we've used theism to invent new forms of medicine like we have used science for. That's not saying we've used theism to build cars the way we've used science for. Like that's a I don't think that this is a works as an analogy because like just fundamental like this is like a weird distinction to
Well,
draw.
how about
Like
rationalism then, right? I believe theism is built on rationalism, and rationalism has absolutely been used to advance things like medicine, science. You couldn't have any science without mathematical principles put forward by rationalism. I would say that
I
you
don't think
couldn't have any.
rationalism necessarily like I don't think you have to be a rationalist to believe that math and logic work. You could say that like those things like I mean when you define rationalism or I didn't really get like a good sense for what rationalism was outside like that didn't work within my worldview. So I didn't necessarily understand like the clash between our ideas here. So like what part of rationalism do we need in order to like get to math that we couldn't have under the idea that like I mean I don't even know
I
what you
understand what
mean
you're
by
trying to
rational.
say.
Yeah,
I
like
understand what you're trying to say. You're trying to ask, why does rationalism have primacy over empiricism when empiricism can still have rational, like you can still believe in rational concepts as an empiricist. You just believe that they're not as important as empirical ones.
well
But
I
the
wouldn't even
reason why I
necessarily say
believe
that. Like I would actually I don't even understand like when I say I'm an empiricist, I mean that empiricism is the best way for us to understand things about like the observable world. But there are still things I don't think empiricism can answer. I don't think empiricism tells us anything about art or philosophy, for example. For outside of like a few things where like philosophy happens to bump into empirical claims. But like what I don't understand is in what like I don't even understand like where your disagreement is when you say you're a rationalist, and I would probably not be. I don't understand where we even disagree on that because I didn't like your definition earlier didn't communicate that idea to me.
Okay, so let's compare the two things. So you have mathematical principles, and then you have empirical principles that have been demonstrated by science.
Mhm.
Which one takes priority as being more true? Well, from a rationalist perspective,
Well,
because those
neither.
empirical, I just want to no, I just want to
Okay, so go ahead.
explain my argument. um, because those empirical principles depend on like the foundation for those empirical principles being true is to assume essentially that the rational principles are true, because science and empirical verification is built on assumed uh, like rational principles that you like that philosophers would then debate whether or not they're true. So, for example, the principle of induction would be a prime example. The principle of induction is ultimately a logical principle. David Hume, for example, didn't believe in the principle of induction, which is ironic because he was an empiricist, the most famous one.
Yeah,
Um,
so
but you have
if I
to, you have.
if I can
Sorry, go
sorry,
on.
if I can jump in, this feels like a very weird thing to say because the idea that like rational like logic as a form of seeking truth, mathematics as a form of seeking truth, and empiricism as in like the study of the empirical world as a form of seeking truth seem to me to be entirely separate categories. I wouldn't say that either of them assumes precedence over the other because they make claims about entirely separate things. Like if empiricism were to somehow make a claim about like the laws of logic that was illogical like first of all I don't even know what that would mean but I don't think that like it couldn't like supersede logic and logic in mathematics if they were to somehow try to make a prediction about the empirical world as in things that we can observe in reality rather than just like logical postulations which again I don't even know how that would happen like what we observe in empirical reality is empirical reality. It doesn't matter what logic or math dictate. So, like what you've described, like this seems like a very weird thing for you to get off about, because like what you're describing to me seem to be separate methods of investigation, trying to find separate types of truths, and you're saying that one has precedence over the other, but I don't even like that seems like a very weird thing to say because again this is where I think I have an issue like ultimately in this debate is I think the idea that like rational thought can get us to claims about empirical reality doesn't make any sense to me. Like
Well,
observations of empirical reality let us understand empirical reality. Rationalism lets us explain rational truths. Those are different categories in my mind.
So that's where I would fundamentally disagree. Like I said at the beginning, the job of rationality is to organize empirical reality into like a rational framework that we can understand it. So let me give an example of how that works. The law of non-contradiction. Okay, that's a rational idea, right?
Mhm.
Now, if you are an empiricist and you don't hold logical principles to be prime, like the primacy of logical principles, then you might be willing to throw out the law of non-contradiction if you believe you discovered something which could contradict itself. And maybe quantum mechanics might be an example of that somehow. Now, of course, through rationalism, you would be able to solve whether or not it is or is not a contradiction. However, like the very idea that reality cannot contradict itself is a rational claim we impose onto empirical reality. That is something rationalism tells us about empirical reality. And that's
Yeah,
given
so
another
I guess
example.
what I would just say is, first off, I don't understand how we could find something empirically that goes against the idea of the principle of non-contradiction. Like that doesn't, I like even quantum mechanics to me doesn't even seem like it goes against like the principle of non-contradiction. That's just something that, like, as far as I've read about quantum mechanics, which is an incredibly interesting field, um, like it seems to me like that doesn't necessarily seem like it would follow that like violates the idea of non-contradiction. But even then, I guess this is where it comes down to me. I don't think the universe cares what we think is rational. If it comes out that like the behavior of electrons somehow does contradict the principle of non-contradiction somehow, well then the principle of non-contradiction just doesn't apply to electrons. If all empirical reality, everything that we can study, leads us to the conclusion that something we assume to be true about logic isn't true, then we simply have to say, well, I guess logic must not apply in this case. Like, how are we going to say that because we thought that this is how something works, and then we observe in reality that that's not true, that our thoughts are more important than what we observe to be real? Like,
What
that seems
you
completely off
well
base.
before I address that specific argument, implicit in your argument, like what you just described there, is exactly how like empiricism. You're using empiricism as as bigger in priority over the logical principle. So you would have to concede the point that yes, one has to take priority over another. You
Well,
either let
I
rational,
mean,
because
but the
that's
thing
what you
is
just
that
did.
I
You
don't.
just let No, but
It,
that's what you just did. You just said that we discovered something empirically that takes primary importance over the logical principle we thought, because the universe doesn't care what we think, and
well,
that would be the empiricist position. So I would explain that, like, if we did find something that contradicted reality, we would simply need you'd have to basically prove logically that it's a contradiction. I would have to prove that it isn't a contradiction, and that there's some sort of other principle that explains what we are observing. So let me give an example, because there actually is an example of this in science somewhat. So when it comes to general relativity and quantum mechanics, they don't exactly contradict, but their implications for our universe do seem to have some contradictory implications that don't seem to quite go together. And scientists are still trying to figure out how to sew these two fabrics together. Now, an empiricist might say, listen, they just contradict and they just do. The universe doesn't care what we think. General relativity is somewhat contradictory to quantum mechanics, and that's just how it is, kind of like what you said. But a rationalist would say, no, they look contradictory to us now, but I can guarantee there is some sort of grand unifying field theory or something, or there's some grand unifying theory of everything, which
Well,
explains the
I don't think
two
that's a
different
disagreement
fields.
between between empiricism and rationality. Like when we like, for example, when we found out that Newton's law of gravitation wasn't there were contradictions, that there were flaws in it, we didn't just say, oh well, actually, like the like there's contradictions in the world. Like we didn't like throw out all of rationality. We just said, oh, maybe we don't understand gravity as well as we think. You know, and this is something that I've heard at some point. Like apparently in like far off physics, they are saying that, like, yeah, the theory of relativity wasn't as robust as we thought it was. We need to come up with a better theory for how gravity works because our previous theories were contradicted by evidence. Like that's sort of what happens. If there are observations of the world that contradict scientific theories, we come up with better explanations for them. So I don't understand, like, again, I do think you're just making like a category error here. I don't think that it's possible for empirical reality and logical ideas to be in contradiction with each other. uh like that doesn't like like I think as a statement that doesn't even make sense. I think what you're describing is the fact that in the far off reaches of science there are things that we haven't figured out and we're trying to come up with a better theoretical basis for understanding all of our observations, and we're doing tests to figure that out, but we don't have that yet. That's a different thing than whether or not we should follow empiricism or not.
So that's no, that's I fundamentally like reject that, because like when you say that we come up with better explanations for the evidence we have, that's not us coming up with better evidence because we have the better evidence. When we're coming up with better explanations, we're creating another logical theory which is supposed to
That's
be
not a
better than.
logical theory.
No. Let me explain. Let me explain. So I'm going to use the example of tectonic plate theory. All right. Um, the thing that solved the tectonic plate theory, right, is so there were a couple of contradictory theories that were around at the time. So in order to explain the archaeological evidence, there were some people who used to believe that in the past there were all these land bridges between the continents that allowed animals to move from one continent to another. Other people believed that the tectonic plates used to be closer together, and that the land masses float on tectonic plates or anything and everything like that. So these were the two debating theories at the time, right? Now, they were both making sense of the empirical evidence, but the land bridge theory had to keep assuming more and more and more and more and more land bridges in order to make the theory work. And so, how we decided that tectonic plate theory was more reliable was Occam's razor. Occam's razor being a logical principle that whichever
Wait, didn't
argument
it have
makes
something
the
to do with the
fewest
Mariana
assumptions.
Trench? Didn't we decide that tectonic plate theory was true because we found the Mariana Trench and saw the splitting of the tectonic plates that tectonic plate theory predicted? Like it wasn't just Occam's razor. Like I mean, that may have been why certain scientists began to favor tectonic plate theory. But the reason we now know tectonic plate theory to be true as opposed to other like other explanations is because we have empirical evidence that shows how tectonic plates work. Like we've seen the ridges of the tectonic plates moving. We can calculate how quickly they move. Like we have all this evidence that suggests that. So I don't think that this is an
Well,
accurate.
well, no, you misunderstand what I'm meaning, because even the Mariana Trench theory would just like you could still with the land bridge theory, you can actually still believe in that. You just need more assumptions to account for the land bridge, to account for the Mariana Trench, and like you're right, like because first of all, we're able to figure out tectonic plate theory before the Mariana Trench. The Mariana Trench simply added more confidence to the theory, right? Whereas and it gave less confidence to the other theory, right? But you could still technically use more assumptions to account for that evidence. The
Yeah.
problem is that logically assumptions, just making a heap of assumptions to make your argument work, is a logical problem, not an empirical one. Meaning that if you don't have logic being primacy over, like correct logic
I don't
being
think this is
prime
an
over.
issue of logic or empiricism being primary. It's an issue of how science works. So in science, what we do is we come up with a hypothesis, we investigate, we come up with a
A
test, see if
hypothesis
it's
is
true.
logical though. A
Okay, yeah,
hypothesis is a
sure.
logical
Okay, well,
principle though.
yeah, yeah. So the scientific process is based off of things like logic or mathematics being true. They have to be true in order for science to work. That's just obvious. But when it comes to like how science works, you make a prediction, you try to verify the prediction, and then you re-come up with a hypothesis based off of what you see in that test, right? So what happened was that we found that tectonic plate theory had more predictive power. It better explained all the evidence we had. And when we made predictions with tectonic plate theory, we realized that we could actually predict things and then go investigate and find out that those things were true. And so that predictive power suggests that tectonic plate theory was true, whereas like the land bridge theory, since it couldn't make those predictions, suggests that it's not true. That's a completely like separate thing. Obviously, you can post hoc rationalize anything if you have added enough post hoc rationalizations. But in science, what they do to figure out whether or not something is true is they go and they try and make testable predictions, and then they test those predictions.
Right, like so that's not at all against what I'm saying, because remember when I said at the start that empirical evidence. So when we view things on the continuum for being more or less likely, empirical evidence for an argument increases the probability of it being true, right? Like when you have a rational principle, you need to it needs to be able to organize the empirical information that's there, and so we need to be able to use that to verify the likelihood of an argument being true, right? So that's not against what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that, like, if you can have like an argument that makes sense of all the empirical evidence. So if we have two arguments, right? and both of them make exactly the same. So they make so both. So you have two arguments. One of them is logically completely incoherent, but it makes sense of all the empirical evidence. The other one uses the exact same amount of empirical evidence, but has better logic. The defining factor here is not the empiricism, because they're both making sense of the empiricism. They're both using the exact same pieces of evidence to support their claim. But how we know that one is a worse argument is because of its internal logic. So the
Yeah,
like and
okay,
the
so
land bridge theory.
I understand
Sorry,
what
go
you're
on.
saying, but that's not a contradiction. Okay, we keep on trying to point to things that are like clashes between evidence and logic. What you pointed to is two things that both have the same amount of evidence for them, but one makes more rational sense. And of course, if something makes more rational sense and has the same amount of evidence, you go with the thing that makes more rational sense. Like that's almost like tautological at some level. The thing is that I don't see like we need to prove to me that we should go with rationalism over empiricism is try and show me like a point where we would need to rely off of rationality more so than evidence in order to demonstrate something. And I don't think that that's, again, I think this is a category error. I don't think that empirical evidence and rational ideas will like generally make claims about like the same type of stuff. I think that this is like a diversion from what we're actually trying to talk about fundamentally.
Well, let me provide an example about how rationality becomes primarily more important than just empiricism if you don't get rationality right. So let's say that we had two arguments. I I said, so rational argument number one, I believe cows have offspring because they reproduce through sex. Let's say that that's an argument, right? That a
Mhm.
person makes from rationality. They're using empirical experience because they say, look, I see other animals doing that, which is a weird thing to watch, or whatever. I see other people reproducing through the same means. I'm applying a sense of induction to say that this is the same way cows reproduce. Now let's use an irrational argument, making the exact same use of the exact same evidence. I think cows are 5 on a Tuesday, x12 -5. Therefore, no reproduction. That's a completely incoherent, irrational. There's no rationality whatsoever, but it still mentions cows. It still has the you know, uh, uh, I guess the empirical. Or maybe I'll reword the argument. I believe cows don't reproduce because I don't want them to. Therefore, when we see more cows, it's because a fairy brings them into existence. Now, saying a fairy brings them into existence, I know you want to say that's analogous to the God thing, but the reason why it's wrong is because it's illogical and makes more
Well,
assumptions because you've assumed an
the issue with
outside
this,
thing.
the issue with this is that like again, one of those people in the instance you gave just does have like it's not even a question of rationality. One of them has more evidence to suggest what they is true because we have like. And this is one of the things that's going to be really difficult to like have this conversation about because I would have to presume that we are in a situation where we don't see cows having sex. We don't see cows give birth. We can't like perform an experiment where we isolate a cow from other cows so it can't have sex. Versus like putting two cows in an area, seeing if they have sex, and then waiting to see if it gets pregnant. Because we can do all the things that we have done all those things, and so we have way more evidence for one of those propositions than the other. So like this isn't a question of just like whether or not like rationality is primacy. Like it's also a question of like which of these like things has more evidence. So like the fundamental
Okay,
problem with talking about this
all right,
idea, and this isn't like an attack on you. It's just it's very difficult to come up with an example where like logic and evidence would contradict. Where I can't just say like one of those things just has more evidence for it. Because like generally that is a big part of how we figure things out is which has more evidence. Because when people try to argue for things, they make rational arguments generally.
right. Like, okay, well, let me try to make a more simple example, right? Like that does use empiricism. So one says we see other animals reproducing through sex. Cows are animals, therefore cows reproduce through sex. Then let's say that you had another guy who says, well, we have empirical evidence that shows that some creatures reproduce through mitosis or something. For example, cells reproduce through mitosis, therefore cows do it. Now, obviously, the guy saying the cells thing is being illogical because his argument does not necessarily follow in the syllogism. He's still making use of, he's actually making more use of empirical evidence. He's appealing to scientific studies
Well,
about, how cells work.
well,
But
no, I mean,
whether or not
Well,
I was going to say whether or
sorry, go
not
ahead.
something could even be counted as evidence supporting something. So you and I both agree that cells splitting has nothing to do with how cows reproduce. How do we know that if it's not for the case of rationality telling us what arguments
Well,
do follow and what arguments don't follow?
well, the thing is, in order to like put those facts in order to use that rationality, the thing is that when someone says we know animals reproduce, therefore cows are animals, therefore animals reproduce, that is the same type of like fundamentally the syllogisms there are the same. The difference is that when someone says an animal is defined differently from a cell, and we know that because of how we've studied animals and cells, and like these words have a lot of meaning with them that comes from what we've empirically seen in the universe, right? Like we've empirically seen animals, we empirically know a lot about how animals reproduce, and in fact, I think there may actually be some things that are considered animals that don't reproduce sexually inside the animal kingdom, inside the kingdom of Animalia, and so saying that cows are animals, animals reproduce through sex, therefore cows reproduce through sex, and saying cows are made of cells, cells reproduce through mitosis, therefore cows reproduce through mitosis. Like those syllogistically, those make the same amount of sense. There is no difference between them. The reason that we know one is true, one is the other, is because one has more evidence for it. Because we can observe more about reality. So this is another example where I don't think it's like possible to isolate these things away from each other, right? Like at some
Well,
level, like
I'm not trying to isolate things away from each other necessarily. I'm trying to say that logic is supposed to tell us what the empirical evidence is saying. So, for example, let's say that the mitosis guy was to add another argument. We have observed in science that stars explode. That is more evidence that cows reproduce by mitosis. Now, obviously, logically, the two arguments have absolutely nothing to do with one another because logically one doesn't follow from the other. Now, in terms of the um, empirical evidence, he's appealing to even more empirical evidence. But because if we have good logic, we will understand that what can be counted as evidence or as relevant to the argument relies on pre-existing logical principles.
okay, but again, at some level, the reason that we know that those things, the reason we can use logic to observe that is because we have evidence about like how these things are. Okay, so like, I guess if what you're trying to get to here is like evidence isn't like obviously evidence has to use rationality in order to be made sense of. Like I never argued against that. Well, and what you, I guess what you were getting at with these examples, what I was trying to understand is the idea that like I agree with the idea. If the idea what they're trying to communicate here is just that we need to have logic before we can do empirical investigation. Like we have to have a rational system at some level before we can do investigation in order to like find things out about science. That has to be true at some level just because of the way humans think, but that doesn't mean that like logic supersedes evidence. To me, I don't think that actually follows. If you wanted to show that logic supersedes evidence, you would have to find an actual example where they contradict. You haven't shown me any examples where they contradict. You only show me examples where logic is helpful and for letting us figure things out. And I agree that logic is helpful. I agree that rationality is extremely important for doing science. I don't think anyone would argue against that.
Right. I think I see what you're trying to say. You're trying to like ask me why do we need like
Well, no. What I'm trying to ask is like you did claim the reason we got on this entire like 20-minute long tangent now, unfortunately, is that you said that like rationality supersedes evidence, and I don't, and I said I don't think that's true. I think that they make claims about different things, and what you've shown is that in order to do science, before we can start investigating to do science, we have to have developed like logic and mathematics, and I agree with that, but I just don't think that that means it like supersedes. I guess I would disagree with that
okay.
language.
So what if okay, so you just admitted, right, that mathematics has to come into being first before we can do science. We have to agree on mathematics before we can go and do science. What if there was a mathematical a mathematical principle, oh sorry, an empirical observation that scientists detected, maybe they're studying the stars and they find a math reading and it actually violates the laws of math. Would they A, use this as an example of why we should throw out math, or B, would they just throw out the observation because there must have been an error in the way we've detected it? We must have made a mistake somewhere. Which one do you think they would choose?
It depends a lot on the situation. Like, I don't even know what you mean by violates a law of math. Like, I don't know what because I keep trying to ask you to point to an observation where we could violate some of these fundamental laws beforehand, and nothing you have even provided has even gone close to that. And I can't think of any. I literally can't think of any observation that we could see of the empirical world that would violate laws of logic or mathematics. That like that phrase doesn't seem to mean anything to me. So can you give any example something like that, of what that would
The
actually be?
the tricky part about that is that every I was to provide a empirical example of something that violates a logical framework. There's always an alternative logical framework which can make better sense of the evidence, which is kind of what I'm saying, that you have all these different logical frameworks. Only one of them can make the best possible sense of the evidence. So, it's
A
like
logical
the
framework is different from an evidence-based theory. Like you can apply multiple sets of evidence to a single logical framework, or you can look at the same set of evidence with different logical frameworks. Like you don't I don't understand what you're trying to refer to here.
so I'll try and give an example of what I'm talking about, right? So let's say that scientists were studying the levels of like how much energy gamma ray or some sort of I can't remember what they're called, but they're like rays of radiation that are going on in outer space. Let's try to measure how much energy that they have. Now let's suppose that you measure the amount of energy, and you do some calculations and you figure out the amount of energy that is based on what the readings are giving you, is that the amount of energy is an absurdly high amount, infinite. Let's say there's infinite amount of energy in that uh in that burst of radiation. Now
You
mathematically
can't.
this doesn't quite seem right.
You
Does that?
could never calculate infinity. That infinity isn't a number. No
Well,
matter
like,
how
okay,
no matter how high of a thing you get to, you can never get to infinity. That's not how
so
infinity
no,
works.
let's say the um the readings they give back, like they're not measuring the energy directly, they're measuring something else. And then so let's say that the gamma rays hit something else, and based on what the other thing it hits, we can just study the effects on that to figure out how much energy it had. So we get finite numbers and we study it and we put it through some math equations. So some astrophysicists get together, they put forward certain math equations to say, here's what we should do with that information. And then they spit out another number on the end, and it's an irrational number like infinity. And then we go, okay, well, we've made a mistake somewhere, or this is new evidence that mathematics does not apply to the universe. Which one would you take?
That what? Okay, so by an irrational number, if you mean I don't know if you mean actually an irrational number, because the phrase irrational number has a meaning within mathematics, or if you just mean something like infinity, something that wouldn't make sense. There is no possible way that measurement could give you infinity. Like that just doesn't make sense. And if it's an irrational number, we measure things that are irrational numbers all the time. Like
No. But the thing is that we do often get not even just infinity. Sometimes when it's just like an absurdly high number that we know it shouldn't be based on our previous rational understanding. Like if we spat out an equation that did give us infinity, which does sometimes happen. What I'm describing does sometimes happen in science, and so what they do is they throw out the finding. They don't throw out mathematics. They throw out
Well,
the reading,
but
because they're
again,
like, all right,
that's
well,
because we have an understanding of what should be taking place based off of both logic and evidence, and we realize that we probably just got an outlier in our equipment was wrong or something like that. Like that's not what you're describing isn't a clash between pure logic and pure evidence. What you're describing is us fucking something up and knowing that both because of a combination of logic and evidence. Like
so
All right, guys.
you just
Gonna
use
have
two.
yeah,
you
we have
gonna
to
have you
stop this at
wrap
some
this
point. I'm
part up,
sorry,
Yeah,
but
okay. Yeah,
and
sorry.
then we're gonna go ahead and do the closing statements after if you wanna finish this train of thought up.
this this is
Yeah.
this
I
was a
was just
train
going to
wreck.
say that there's no such thing as pure logic or pure evidence. Like you need one to like be able to verify the other. Like, and it's just that in terms of which you should give primacy to doing the verifying, I would say logic, because otherwise you'll end up with a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if I can give my closing statement, I
Yeah, I'm
don't.
gonna have you do yours first there. Pumkinswift. You got 5 minutes.
Okay, so I will say first off, I'm very sorry to the audience that we ended up going in a direction that what wasn't necessarily what you proposed on the debate topic. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes you get off on a tangent and you don't end up where you want to. Uh, Speaking about what we actually ended up talking about, which was a lot of this idea of like how we know about rationality and all this other stuff. I think that Christian Anarchist here has some very strange ideas about like how we know things and like what types of knowledge exist and how you should apply them. I still don't think that there is such a thing as like a contradiction between like rationality and like a primacy of either rationality or primacy of evidence. Those make claims about different things. They are different methods of investigation that we use for like different reasons. So different types of data or of evidence, and so you can't like there's no such thing as like the primacy of one over the other. There's no point where you would say, oh, I, for rational reasons, think that this must be the case, where somebody else can say, well, for evidentiary based reasons, I think this is the case. You either have something that you either have evidence that proves something wrong, or the both people are looking at the same amount of evidence and coming to like different arguments based off of rationality. There isn't like this whole thing about like primacy just doesn't actually like come up, and I think that's the exact reason why Christian anarchists, throughout all these examples they're to throw out, was never actually able to give us an example of a time where you would need to use rationality over evidence, like in a practical example. Everything he said was a situation where there wasn't a clash between those two things. It was a different outlier, a different like evidence based thing, a different like something that didn't make sense at a different level that ended up clashing in there. And to get back to like the whole question of the God thing, I do think this actually does kind of matter, because this idea that like rationality is some bigger thing outside of evidence is at some level the backdrop for his belief in God, right? He does say that like, well, rationalism leads me to a belief in God, and the reason I believe in rationalism is because sometimes you have to take rational thoughts over evidence, right? But again, he couldn't even present an example of where that's the case, because again, there actually is no clash between these ideas. So I think that his basis of rationalism, at least as he understands it, isn't really like very well built. It doesn't seem like it gives us much. It doesn't seem like it explains anything that we couldn't explain some other way. I don't even know what he's trying to like gesture to as a flaw in a non-rationalist perspective, because he wasn't able to articulate it. So given like that failure, I think it like again, this is kind of like something else we'd have to get into a debate about like another time. And I would love to debate more on topic about this, if even again with Christian anarchists here, if we could get away from the unfortunate rabbit hole we did down here. But like if his argument is just rationalism is true, and through the rationalism we can understand like what he said during his opening statement to God, the fact that he was unable to demonstrate why rationalism is so important throughout the discussion, I think, does give us some pause for concern. And I'll see the rest of my time.
No, thank you for that. Christian anarchist, go ahead when you're ready. Floor is yours.
Okay, so the main issue that he has with my ultimate argument comes down to rationalism, and he believes I was not able to provide an example where rationalism may be needed to be given primacy over empirical evidence. But my brother in Christ, you gave the example actually. I remember you said in the debate that that science requires an agreement on mathematics first. That mathematics comes before science. Now, that in order for you to be able to do science to make sense of any empirical evidence, um, you need to have rationality correct. You need to have mathematics correct before you, and that was the words you used, before we can do science. That's the example. Now, the reason why that you can work around that is you could say, well, um, I guess you could say that if you wanted to do empiricism first, so you wanted to do scientific principles first, and then read them into mathematics. Well, the problem is that you don't have a rational framework to tell you like how to do that. Basically, this is kind of the problem with logical positivism. I'm not saying that he's using logical positivism necessarily, but it does seem similar. But this is the reason why logical positivism has failed as an ideology, and why mathematics in the real world, mathematics is used to be placed over like a lens from which we view science, and the lens is what, like, because we're using that as a lens, is what's given primacy, that we need to get that right correct first before we can find out what science is telling us. And so you can use an incorrect lens and get the exact same evidence. So it's not he keeps saying that I haven't produced a contradiction between rationality and science. it's not so much that there being a contradiction; it's there being a inability for empirical evidence to express anything about reality without logic. That all of all of empiricism, sorry, depends fundamentally on rationality. If you make a pure logical argument, or not even a pure logical argument, if you make a logical argument that's completely logically consistent and uses a fewer amount of empirical evidence, that's a better argument than a empirical argument which is completely and utterly logically contradictory and requires we throw out math and get rid of that. And if you disagree with me, ask yourself which one you would believe. Ask yourself which one do you think is more likely. You have one theory which is completely logically consistent and it makes use of fewer empirical principles, but still makes use of empirical principles. The other one uses rational principles, but is completely logically contradictory and makes use of more empirical evidence. Well, obviously, the only way that you can even know that empirical evidence is telling you one thing over another is by imposing a rational framework onto it. And so it's not so much that there's a contradiction, is that empiricism requires rationalism, and that's why rationalism is more important. In the same way that in order for you to be able to, I guess, in order to start a fire, you need fuel. So fuel is the more important component than the fire itself, because you don't have fire without the fuel. It's a bit of a clumsy analogy. I'm using it just for the sake of time. But at the risk of repeating myself, I think I'll just yield my time there.
Thank you very much. Uh, that was interesting. Um,
Yeah,
have a
actually, can I say one thing to everybody here, including the audience, before we get on to the questions?
Go ahead and try to make it short.
I'm sorry. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, it's all
Jeez,
right.
what a
It's all right.
really let that one get out of hand.
We only have 2 questions, so I think this one's gonna be for you, Christian Anarchist. Uh, why do you think the existence of logic, objective truth, requires a creator deity? Can't logical existence just be a different plane of existence than the physical world? Logic doesn't have time, so it would be an eternal, unchanging truth. Why would we need a God to create that? Oh, yeah, for Christian Anarchist. You can unpack that
Well,
like
that's
one piece at a time if you want.
well, that wasn't necessarily my argument. So my argument is that we have a certain kind of belief or a priori knowledge, and that a priori knowledge might even be incorrect for all I know, right? That would be bad for what it means about God. But I'm not saying logic requires God. That's not my argument. You can have conceptually logic without God. Technically, it is possible, yes. But what I'm saying is that there is a certain kind of knowledge that requires a mind, and that mind is either I'm simplifying the argument here, but it requires either an eternal mind to possess it and then give it to everyone else, or or a mind to be able to create it out of nothing. And the reason why I believe that is because a priori knowledge isn't. It's not so much that all logic is a priori. Well, I guess you could say that, but the ability to do logic is itself like not prompted by physical empirical sensations. That there's some sort of external mechanism to that. Um, and I guess that's so I'm not saying that logic itself. I'm not inherently saying that like there's no other way for logic to exist. That's not actually my argument, I guess.
Thank you. um, we got one for you as well, Pumkinswift. Animals develop Pavlovian responses because of involuntary reactions to sense input. Humans can experience this too, and we differentiate it from deduction. Do you think that all logical deduction is actually, in fact, an involuntary reaction to sense data? If so, how can we ever assign truth or falsify or falsity to our deductions?
Okay, so I think I did expand on that a little bit later in the debate, but the point of bringing up that wasn't to show that there was like that dogs and humans are perfectly capable of the exact same types and amount of like rational thinking or anything. What that was to show was that there was a type of like thinking, something that we could describe as conscious in some sense in dogs. And as I extrapolated on earlier, there does seem to be a smooth gradient of that type of consciousness or thinking in different types of animals, because there are types of animals that don't have that level of Pavlovian responses. And there are, like, for example, dogs have like social structures. Lots of other types of animals don't have social structures. Some of them are too simple. Some of them do a lot of different things. And so we can see different like types of behaviors and different types of what seems to be like psychological states. There are different types of animals, and so that was a rebuttal to the idea that like there was some type of a priori knowledge in consciousness, which seemed that couldn't have developed through evolution, which I rebutted by simply saying, well, here's an example of different types of like thinking and knowledge developing through what we know our evolutionary means. And let me see what else was the rest of the question. Do you think that all of production? Uh, as to the second part of the question, do you think all logical deduction is actually, in fact, involuntary reaction to sense data? I mean, I feel like that sort of comes out to whether or not you believe in like free will is a thing, whether or not we choose something versus whether or not all of our thoughts and actions are simply a reaction to what's around us. I tend to err on against free will, but I also would call myself a compatibilist, I guess. I don't know if we can actually know whether or not free will is a thing. I don't know how you would even test that. So I guess a question mark on that one. I don't know if like there's a way that we can know the difference between deduction just being a reaction to sense data or not.
Thank you. I guess since those are the only questions and we do have a little bit more time left, if you guys aren't in a rush to be somewhere, I'll invite anybody from the audience that wants to come up if they want to ask any questions directly or talk about any of the stuff that was discussed in that debate. Just raise your hand.
Can I also just quickly address something that
Absolutely.
Pumpkin said. So he said that like I'm making an argument that this couldn't have come about from evolution. I'm not strictly saying that, because I did make the argument that, well, it's possible we could have inherited it from our parents, but then where did they get it from? Where did they get it from? Sort of kicks the can up the road. In the evolutionary system that we have observed, where can we say this a priori knowledge has sort of inserted itself? So we know that cells probably don't have it. We know that slightly bigger cells don't have it, etc. Where in the evolutionary chain did this sort of just show up? Was the argument I was making.
Okay, well, I mean, and I think pointing to the slow, gradual, injection of different types of behaviors and thinking into organisms sort of shows that we can see the evolution of lots of different things, and if we assume that evolution large more complicated thinking and stuff like that is also goes along with that as it seems to, then well, this a priori knowledge evolved the same way everything else did, slowly and gradually, along with everything else in all of in every species of every animal.
Alrighty.
But I would
Well,
No,
go
I
ahead.
didn't think I was going to come in this quick. Um, Hi.
Hey, man.
Uh, I don't know if this was. I came in kind of late in the debate, so I don't know if this was addressed before. But like, oh my god, this could just sound like a really stupid, simple question. But like, why does there have to be a god, and why can't? Because I think because the Big Bang theory, as I understand it, doesn't necessarily say that like there was nothing and then Big Bang and everything was there. Everything was still there. It was just condensed into a infinite, like a very small point, and then it rapidly expanded. But everything was still there. So that to me, I mean, and I don't think that needs a creator necessarily. Why couldn't that have just always been there, and then decided to expand or whatever, or conditions led to it expanding?
I imagine that's directed at me since I'm a theist. So my answer to that question is that you're right. There doesn't necessarily have to be a god. I don't believe in necessity itself. I believe that I'm simply making the argument, as I would make with all other arguments, that there's more likely to be a god than to not be a god. And I have two reasons for that. One, I don't believe in necessity. I don't believe there is such a thing as an argument you can make where something has to be the case. I think it's like you can make an argument where something is 99.999% likely to be the case, but I don't believe that anything is ever like you have to. But the reason why I think it is more likely that God exists is a number of arguments, but referring to the cosmological one, so just for the sake of time, I would say that consciousness, as we understand and how we tend to define it, is about spontaneity. That like consciousness, and if it does have free will, it can act spontaneously, and not necessarily deterministically caused by like its prior causes. And that's exactly what the first cause of the universe by definition would be. It wouldn't be caused by anything prior, meaning it would be spontaneous, meaning it would resemble in causal behavior something like a consciousness.
Yeah,
Again, that's
I
a
think that's a
probabilistic
pretty
argument, though.
I think that's
That's
a
a
pretty
probabilistic.
silly argument. First, like, we don't know that free will exists. Like psychologically, we don't like free will is like a big question mark in that field. And so this idea that like spontaneity is a part of consciousness, spontaneity is not a part of what we define as consciousness. First off, there isn't even a necessarily a good like working definition of consciousness currently. Like this is something that we're still trying to figure out, and part of the reason why is because the way that we as humans experience the world is very different from the way all other the animals that we would call non-conscious experience the world, and it's hard to figure out. Like we have to use a lot of theoretical stuff to try and figure out what the boundaries are there, and also we don't even know necessarily how other animals experience the world. We only know that it's different from us. Like it's a very hard thing to study. So I guess I would fundamentally at first reject the idea that like consciousness or spontaneity is an inherent part of consciousness, and I also don't think that like just because two things have one thing in common that means that one is necessarily related to the other. Just because things happen spontaneously doesn't mean, and consciousness may or may not be spontaneous. That has something to bear on whether or not those things are related.
I suppose that's all I really have right now. Like I said, I came kind of late into the debate, so I don't really have much to ask a question, Mitch, to ask questions about.
Yeah.
It's all good. Fair enough.
I love you guys. Bye.
Yeah. Thanks for
thank
hopping
you.
on here
Thank
at
you.
least.
Seemed nice.
Yeah, young baby Tate, you want to come up? You have to
Oh
unmute
boy,
yourself.
Howdy,
we're about
guys.
to get. How are you?
So, hold on. I don't know if I can hear you guys. Is anyone talking right now?
Nope.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Sounds like I can't hear anyone. Give me just one sec.
Yo, hey, yo, 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 yo.
It's the Matrix. The
I'll tell
Matrix
him we
is
can hear
suppressing him.
him.
Yeah, we can hear him. He can't see because the Matrix is trying to blind him.
Yeah, apologies too, folks. Honestly, I wouldn't even have known how to steer these guys onto a different track if I would have interrupted them.
I mean, I honestly, I do think that interruption earlier would have been nice. I kept debating with myself whether or not I should just like hop in and be like, wait, no, we need to stop talking about this and talk about a different topic, or whether I should just continue the argument. I kept debating that in my head, and I never took the initiative to change the topic of conversation. Hopefully, at least people enjoyed it, even if it wasn't, you know, where I thought we'd end up.
Well, I think all
Honestly,
arguments. I was just going to say, I think all arguments really, like whenever you watch a lot of these debates, they really are just coming down to rationalism versus empiricism. So I think it's still a very important, debate to have.
Yeah,
Like it's
well,
still
I
like,
fundamentally, I think the debate we showed is just you having misunderstanding about what that means. Again, like the idea that I agree with what you said, and I did want to say this before because I think this is where this communication comes from. I agree with the idea that like we have to have some type of rational thinking before we can engage in like uh, evidence gathering for like science. I don't think that means like what you say about primacy, and you did repeat this a few times. Is you think that therefore that means that rationality is like primary over evidence, and like if there were ever a contradiction between the two things, that we should take rationality over evidence. I just disagree with that fundamentally because I don't think that's a type of contradiction that could exist, and so I don't think that that's a rational like thing to say. I don't think that's a rational extrapolation from that idea.
I think we can both agree that. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
I think he's talking.
Just I can actually hear now, so just so you guys.
Oh, go
Yeah,
ahead. You can
that's
ask the
good.
question
Yeah, go ahead and ask your
yourself.
question, man.
So I guess my question again is for like Pumpkin. I guess maybe a double question, but I promise I won't just like totally like abuse and batter.
It's fine.
So I guess my first question is: so do you then consider yourself like a naturalist or more like an anti-realist?
I mean, I'm not I'm not the best with the definitions of all these words. I guess I would call
Oh,
myself a
sorry.
naturalist.
Yeah.
As in, I think that the natural world is all that exists, or at least is all that's been demonstrated to exist. And I think that we should believe things to be true only when there's evidence presented that they are true. The only things I take, the only like claims that I think I take at face value outside of things that have been presented like a good evidence for based off of like a sufficient logical framework is the idea that the problem of hard solipsism isn't accurate, and the idea that our sense data corresponds to an actual physical world outside of ourselves. Essentially, those are the only two things I think I guess I take like on faith, as it were. Outside of that, I think
Okay, so yeah,
everything.
then you'd be like a naturalist. Gotcha.
Yeah. Anything else you want to ask?
Yeah, so like do you think that like denying the existence of free will leads to any kind of absurd conclusions like the fact that like moral admonishment would be pointless?
No, not necessarily. I because like here's like even if we say like, well, I guess free will doesn't exist or whatever. The fact is, at least in our own like conscious minds or whatever, even if we were always going to make a decision or whatever at some point, we still experience ourselves making a choice, and the amount of like value we get out of the idea of like morality being a thing that exists, and like trying to use moral admonishment, it would justify the idea of treating people as if they have choices, even if they like don't necessarily like, even if somebody will prove that free will doesn't exist. Like, I would still hold you accountable for punching me because you chose to punch me in every meaningful use of the word. The fact that you are always destined to do that because you are always going to come to that decision no matter what doesn't change how I feel about it, I guess. Like, does that answer your question?
I mean, maybe. So like I guess for instance, like if like lightning struck my house, I wouldn't say that that lightning chose it, even though like it leads to like the same outcome, I suppose. And I mean, like maybe that just comes in virtue of the fact that we can't punish lightning, but like, do you kind of get at least like the
Yeah.
kind of like point that I'm trying to get across?
Yeah, I guess like I can understand why you would say that, but again, there are two things I would like bump into there. First off, like at least in my own conscious experience, even though I don't believe I have free will at some level, I still feel like I'm making choices, and so I think having a moral framework for that reason, like and holding people morally accountable for things, quote unquote, still makes sense. And secondly, again, the amount of like utility we get from like a moral stance from the idea that people are moral agents that can make decisions is so vast that like if you think that there is such a thing as some things being morally good over other things, which I do, and I think you can hold that while still thinking that like free will doesn't necessarily exist. Like I think that we even if we know that it's not the case, we should still treat people as if they can make choices because we gain too much from it. And then leaving that to the wayside would have too bad consequences. So even if like we have to act as if something that isn't true is true, like it still makes more sense to do that in the long run because of what it lets us do.
So you said like hard solipsism like obviously doesn't work, but also like I'm assuming that you think that like sense experience is generally trustworthy.
Yeah, I also said that. That's another. Those are the two assumptions I make essentially. Hard
Okay,
solipsism is false. Our sense data corresponds to an objective reality outside of ourselves.
so how much gravity then do you put on the fact that like just about everything about your sense data says that you're free, at least in some kind of restricted sense,
Um,
and
I
that my
guess
sense data says the same thing about me, and I'm assuming just about anyone else's sense data would say this.
Yeah, well, the issue is that like when we say about what free will, like again, when I said it's an unfalsifiable position, in order to disprove that, you'd have to like run a person through the exact same situation multiple times and see if they could make different choices, which is literally impossible. Like without like inventing time travel, we'll never know. And so like I think people can experience things as if they have the ability to make choices without like necessarily being able to have like actual multiple diverging timelines where people make different choices. Like you can experience the ability to make choices without actually like being able to do that. And I think the fact that we can experience it that way is incredibly meaningful. But I don't think that like it necessarily proves that free will does exist.
Okay, that's actually pretty interesting. Like the idea that like free will is unfalsifiable. I mean, and I guess I would hope it is since I think it's true, but I would ground the
Well,
existence of free will in kind of a more roundabout way than like directly proving that free will is a thing. But
yeah, well, I
that's
mean,
neither
it
here nor
definitely
there.
also means
I was definitely just like curious about like what you would say given your views and stuff like that.
yeah, and again, when I said I'm a compatibilist, what that means is that I don't think we have free will, but I also don't care. I mean, if you like at some level, what you can say is like people make the decisions that make the most sense for them, and so the fact that people would theoretically make the same decision, given the same circumstances, no matter what, because like the things that they consider important at a conscious or subconscious level will always be the same, so it'll always leave them to like look at everything and come to the same conclusions about how they should act. Like that doesn't like seem like it gets rid of the ability for people to make choices in a meaningful sense for me. So even though I think that like if you could test it, we might end up, and I would say it's more likely than not that we would prove that like people can't make different choices and different if you repeat the experiment. That doesn't mean to me that people don't meaningfully make choices. Like there's a disproof that assumption.
Okay. Yeah, like compatibilism. Yeah, you said that you were like kind of leading towards compatibilism. I think that like yeah, I'm kind of maybe not a unicorn, but I don't see this view as common as I'd like to, but like I don't think that free will can be like a justification for like dualism, and by dualism I mean like that we like have an immaterial mind. I think that actually dualism, you'd have to prove dualism to argue for free will rather than like free will being evidence for dualism. So I guess that's
Perhaps there could
just
be another. I was just gonna say, perhaps that could be another debate later,
Yeah,
Pumpkin.
that'd be very interesting. I'd love to see people debate that, but I don't necessarily have like extremely strong opinions on free will. This is just mostly intuitive stuff, and from what little I've read about the ideas.
yeah. I was definitely just kind of like curious about your own views. Christian Anarchist, did have you read Miracles? A lot of like what you've been arguing for sounds really similar to like C.S. Lewis's like what does he call it, like the cardinal problem of naturalism.
Uh, I'm familiar. I haven't read C.S. Lewis's stuff on miracles. No, I read David Hume's stuff on miracles, and that's about it.
C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Miracles, and it's less about miracles and more just like a massive philosophical treatise on like believing in favoring supernaturalism over naturalism, and it's like actually a very very good book. So I guess I'd recommend it because it's kind of along the vein of a lot of what you've been arguing about tonight.
I mean, I'll take a look, but the fact of the matter is that I don't think the supernatural is a meaningful category, so I'd still probably disagree with him. Like, I think we just sort of colloquially just lump certain things in the wastebasket of the word supernatural without a consistent definition of what that means.
Yeah, I know he kind of like defines what he's talking about in the beginning, so I mean maybe just like
Yeah, I'll
take
actually
his
say
definition and run with it, but you know.
I think we didn't get to this, but I think when you say that, you're actually to some degree true because like again, definitionally, if something supernatural were proven to be true, eventually we would at least attempt to like sort of consume it into the natural world, right? Like if somebody proved that like people were capable of casting spells, right? Like in Harry Potter or some shit. Scientists would study that and try to figure out how it works, right? We would at least attempt to make it a natural process.
Yeah,
Yeah, we
I
do gotta
guess
wrap this up.
I guess that would just depend on how you cash out the word like proven, and
Yeah, yeah.
that's the last thing I'll say about.
Yeah, well, let's go ahead and and head out though. Thanks to everyone for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank you guys for doing this.
Sorry
Probably
we
be
went
good to
so
have
far
you.
over time.
Yeah. Oh no, it's all right. I had the time. I just kept bumping it forward. Uh, I think you guys should do a follow-up debate maybe on some of the things you guys touched on. There's like a whole lot to unpack there.
We could do another follow up debate on this exact same topic again and try to stay more on topic this time.
Well, I was just going to say, when it comes to rationalism and empiricism, those two positions at the end of the day, because I can argue rationalism from a rational perspective, but that's circular. So it's ultimately built on axioms at the end of the day. Like it's how you define things. It's like the axioms you choose, which rationalism follows from. So I don't know if this is resolvable. It's kind of just, like this
Yeah,
is just what you do. So
yeah.
I definitely love to debate dualism, though. That sounds fun.
I don't know if I'd be down for that debate. It's not something I.
Everybody feel free to like move down to Hangout VC. You guys can continue the discussion there. While you're still in the mood if you want. And yeah, we'll see you all next time.
Yeah, see you around.